not on this chain, to Susan Crichton and Leslie Sewell of the 6th of June 2012. And he says, Susan Leslie, attached is Ron's proposal. My view is that we make it clear to Alice and Paula the distinction between the work Ron is proposing, brackets, an independent review of past cases, and the Horizon forensic audit, the Deloitte proposal, and put it on the agenda to discuss tomorrow, which would be the 7th of June. At this stage, were you aware that there were two contenders for the undertaking of some form of investigation, review, or audit?
From the documentation, I can see that's the case. I couldn't recall it at the time. And I think I say in my statement that the Deloitte work, which was named Project Spire, was not something that I remembered, but I can see that there were those two alternatives being discussed.
Can you remember the distinction between them, i.e. what was proposed to be done by Second Sight and what was to be done by Deloitte?
No, I can't recall the distinction, but I can see it from what was being said here. And I don't know, to be honest, how much I remember that, how much I understood that distinction at the time. Looking at the documents, they're clearly very different. The Project Spire document is a forensic investigation of the Horizon system.
And sorry to interrupt, by a forensic investigation of the Horizon system, is that captured by these words here, a forensic audit?
Yes, and I've just read that, so I've used forensic because I've just seen it on there. I would have said a detailed investigation of the Horizon system. My concern at the time, my priority at the time, was to choose an organisation whom I felt would relate best with the sub-postmasters who had been raising their claims.
As it's described here, the work that Second Sight were proposing, by contrast, was a review of past cases.
Yes.
Okay. Can we see what happened then, please? Poll 0023 3736. Now, this is a timeline that has been prepared after the event, of the events which led to and happened in the course of the mediation scheme. But it's the best and only record I think we've got of what happened on the 7th of June, the day following the email that I've just read to you.
Right.
And can we look, please, at page 3? And do you see in the box that's at the bottom of the screen there, it's recorded that on the 7th of June 2012, a meeting is held between you, Alice Perkins, Susan Crichton, Olwyn Lyons and Simon Baker, where the Deloitte and Second Sight proposals are discussed.
Yes.
And Second Sight was chosen as the preferred supplier.
Yeah.
But why was Second Sight proposal preferred to that of Deloitte?
I think, because of what I just said earlier, from my own recollection, is I felt very strongly that we needed an organisation who would be able to work well with sub-postmasters. I was concerned that any one of the big four, Deloitte being one of them, may have come across too corporate and wouldn't necessarily have had the understanding of running a post office and small retail businesses. I don't recall, which is why, let me finish what I'm saying. I don't recall looking at the proposals in detail at the meeting.
That's what I was going to ask. Rather than which might be preferred by sub-postmasters, how it might look going to one of the big four, was the substance of what each organisation was going to do a relevant consideration?
I don't recall that. I don't, and the reason I feel sure about that recollection is that when, in preparing for today, I looked at what was called the Project Spire document, I was quite surprised about the detail in it. And one of my reflections now is that actually that would have been a very good piece of work to have done, because it may have brought more data to the fore than we knew.
That's a question that I'm going to turn to in a moment. And it is the short point that the second site review was much narrower in scope, in that it was proposed that the system should be reviewed by looking at a sample of past cases.
Yes, I believe that's the case.
Rather than auditing the Horizon system as a whole.
Absolutely the case in terms of my view today. I don't believe we went through that particular angle of discussion in the meeting.
Is that right? What would you say to the suggestion that a deliberate choice was made to pick a proposal that was much narrower in scope, that only looked at a sample of past cases, rather than auditing the Horizon system as a whole?
Oh, well, from a personal point of view, I would say that was absolutely not the case. I have no recollection of that at all.
You agree, I think, cutting to the chase, that it would have been preferable, looking back now, had Deloitte been chosen, because their proposal may or even would have brought to the surface, if carried through to its conclusion, many of the issues that were subsequently discovered.
I think the operative word is may.
Mm-hmm.
I have reflected on that. Whether Deloitte would in fact have surfaced some of the other important areas that Second Sight did, I don't know, because I think one of the other outcomes of this has been the right decision was looking at the contract, and that may not have surfaced through the Deloitte work, which was particularly focused on the system itself.
Can we look, please, at the terms of reference, or at least an early copy of the terms of reference that were settled for Second Sight, poll 309-6576. And if we just blow that up, please, you'll see that this is a Second Sight document, and it is, quote, a proposal to carry out an independent review of past fraud and theft cases in order to determine whether the facts support the business's findings and the charges brought against individuals. And then if we go to the detail on page 5, please. Can you see that the proposal is for a case review, and the case review will include the following tasks, said Second Sight: selecting a representative sample of cases that have led to prosecutions, court-appointed restitution. The sample needs to cover cases where defendants claim they didn't take any cash, where assertions have been made that the system, i.e. Horizon, caused the shortage, including old and new versions of Horizon if possible, and which have been taken up by MPs. And then if you look at the last, or the second to last bullet point, study and selectively test the Horizon system in order to find any black hole, program bug, etc., that might have caused mysterious shortages. What's described there, selecting a representative sample of cases that led to prosecutions or court-appointed restitutions, and then study and selectively test the Horizon system in order to find bugs, for shorthand, that may have caused mysterious shortages, was exactly what was needed, wasn't it?
Yes.
It didn't happen, though, did it?
The work that the Post Office and Second Sight did over this quite long period of time didn't come to a final conclusion. No.
Well, it didn't, and we're not talking about the mediation scheme yet, because
Right.
that was a second piece of work, essentially. We're talking about the events that led to the interim
Right.
report in July 2013. That's what this proposal is about. A representative sample of cases that led to prosecutions was not selected, was it?
I don't recall the cases that were selected. Looking at this today, I don't recall the narrow focus on prosecution and court-appointed restitution. My recollection is that we were looking at a broad sample of cases, of which some were cases with criminal convictions. I thought it was broader than that. I don't recall it as being that narrow.
Well, we'll see how things got changed by the Post Office.
Right, okay.
In the events which happened, i.e. over time. Would you agree that if what is described here in those 2 bullet points that I have identified had in fact been undertaken, again, there is, to use the may word, a possibility that the decade that followed until faults in Horizon and the miscarriages of justice identified by the Court of Appeal may have been discovered earlier?
I think that is a possibility. I saw in the inquiry documentation that there is a piece of advice that Susan Crichton sought from Richard Morgan QC, where he said that he thought that the advice was that the Post Office really shouldn't get into this at all, because it would be a no-win situation.
It would open the floodgates.
It would open the flood. Well, I think he made 2 conclusions from memory. That was one, and I can't remember what the other one was. But my reflection as I read this recently was that, first of all, I didn't know that she had taken that advice, and it came up later, a year later, when she and I had a conversation about her wanting to leave the business, and I suspect we may come on to that. But when I look at that advice now, I think it is a great pity that we didn't know about that, because we may have approached this differently.
And can you explain why? I.e., had you, and I think you mean the executive and the board,
Yes.
known about Richard Morgan's advice, you may have approached things differently. In what way?
In that we may well have focused completely separate, understanding the advice he gave, that we may have focused very differently on what we called in shorthand the criminal cases, because they needed to be reviewed differently to others that were not criminal cases. And what we ended up with was a scheme that tried to respond to a variety of different cases and themes.
Let's look at what the Post Office did in relation, in particular, to criminal cases. That document can come down, please. I turn to a couple of days after the meeting of the 7th of June to the 9th of June, poll 309-6606. If you forgive me one moment. If we look at the foot of the page, please. There is an email from Alice Perkins of the 9th of June, 9:36, to you. And she says, following a conversation with Olwyn yesterday, given I'm away for a few days, I thought I should let you know before I went where I stand on which cases should be in or out of this review. I've given this more thought since yesterday. I am clear that we should include all, in capital letters, the MP's cases, irrespective of whether they have been decided in court. If we try to draw a distinction here, we will be accused of picking cases to suit ourselves and being vulnerable on the ones we omit. We'll have a row about that instead of moving the issue on. On reflection, I don't buy the argument that we would somehow undermine the court process by doing this. There are plenty of ways in which people can go over ground which has been settled in court, and if there weren't, no one would ever be able to get a conviction overturned. And if, which we don't believe, there were new evidence in a case which had been decided, we would want to do, and be seen to do, the right thing by that. And then if we scroll up the page, we see you replying in the bottom part of the page, which I think is about admin, essentially. And then...
I think it says I wasn't part of the discussion, doesn't it?
Yes.
Yes.
And then if we go a little bit further up, Alwyn replies to you, and I think to you alone, Paula, in case Susan doesn't pick this up as she's in Berlin and before you speak to Alice, the issue that came to light with the list of MP cases was that they included the Mishra, I think that's Seema Misra. You will remember the case and the publicity. She went to prison and had her baby whilst in there. The husband got publicity through radio and press. Susan's anxiety, and she raised this at the meeting with Alice before you joined, was whether now contacting her to tell her we review the case would be a red rag to a bull. Alice feels this is the business pushing back unnecessarily, and she feels this happened throughout the process, and she is having to keep pushing us. Susan's getting external advice on the effect that this would have on cases which have been brought through the courts. There's quite a lot in there. Did you agree with Alice Perkins that all cases should be included in the independent review, even if they involved criminal convictions?
Yes, I wasn't making any distinction.
Did you agree with Alice Perkins that the business was pushing back unnecessarily against that?
I don't think I knew that, and I think this is so. The bit of admin that we skipped over is I say that I'll call Alice, which I did, and I think she explained to me the conversation that she had had. And from what I've seen in documentation, clearly there was an awful lot of consideration going on about what should and shouldn't happen, which I was not in the loop on.
Who would be the business that was pushing back unnecessarily against the chair?
Well, the only thing that I can think is relating back to this piece of advice that Susan sought from Richard Morgan, which was very clear advice to her, and one assumes that she was she discussed it in a meeting, and one assumes that that must have alerted her to maybe needing to take different approaches with cases like Mrs. Misra's, for instance, but I wasn't involved in those conversations. And there is I'm not sure, there is a further pushback, I can't remember if it's before this or after, where the terms of reference which are prepared by, again, I think Susan, refer to defence documents, and Alice comes back and says, no, it should be all of the documentation.
So the business here, you take pushing back unnecessarily, you take to mean shorthand for Susan Crichton?
For the legal team, yes. I think it was Susan Crichton and Hugh Flemington who were at the meeting.
It says that this has happened, or it's Alice's view that this has happened throughout the process. Was that a view that you were aware of, that the business was pushing back unnecessarily against a review throughout the process?
Not until I spoke to Alice, which I did, I think, on the Saturday morning. I was concerned, and so if a chairman raises issues like this, I wanted to know what had arisen.
Did you think that Mrs. Misra's case should be included in an independent review?
I wasn't even involved in the conversation about that. My view was that all the cases that had come forward through Lord Arbuthnot and thereafter from other MPs, we were going to review all of the cases.
Did you share Miss Crichton's concerns recorded here that even contacting Miss Misra
No.
would be a red rag to a bull?
No.
Did you know that Post Office was getting external advice on the effect that bringing such cases within the review would have?
Well, clearly I did, in the sense that Alwyn mentions it in the final line on this email. I don't at that stage think I would have asked more about it, because the situation was resolved in that all of the cases were going to come in. If Susan was seeking advice on something of a legal nature, I would expect her to do that, and then I would listen to whatever that advice was.
Do you know what external advice the Post Office did take regarding the effect of including cases like Seema Misra's in the independent review?
I don't think so. I certainly didn't see the Richard Morgan advice.
I don't think there was a written advice. There was a meeting with him.
There was a meeting note, right, yeah. I don't think I did, no.
Have you got a date readily to hand to remind me of when that was, Mr. Peel?
Given a moment, I
No.
probably could.
I'm sure we'll find it between us. Don't take yourself out of your stride.
Thank you. Did you know the substance of the advice, the external advice that was given?
No, not until I read it in preparation for the inquiry.
Did you and therefore the board take not take the advice given, as you now know, by Richard Morgan KC into account in deciding the scope of Second Sight's review?
No, I don't believe. You would have to ask Alice Perkins, but I don't believe that Alice Perkins or the board knew of that advice. But Susan had a conversation with Alice that I was not involved in, so it's possible it was shared in that meeting, but my understanding is not.
Thank you. Can we move on into 2013, please? And look at poll 0010-0200. This is a minute, I think, from, as we can see, David Oliver to you, copied to others, of the 5th of February 2013. Could you explain who David Oliver was, please? David
Oliver, I believe, was on a short-term contract, maybe a year or two. He was either a consultant with PA Consulting or had left them and came to the Post Office and was working on the Project Sparrow work. In fact, looking at the list, what date is this, please?
5th of February 2013.
2013. No, he was working on the Sparrow project.
He sends this minute to you and others regarding essentially options that the Post Office could take to deliver the scheme in a timely fashion. You can see that there.
Yes.
Under summary. We identified 3 broad courses of action that might be taken to improve the ability of Post Office successfully to deliver the mediation scheme in a timely fashion. Can we look at page 2, please? And scroll down to what was the third option, Plan C, a contingency plan to replace Second Sight if they refuse to work on the scheme under terms which the Post Office find acceptable. Engagement of a professional accountancy firm such as Grant Thornton to replace Second Sight entirely. It's possible that Second Sight will refuse to work under the proposed terms of engagement from the Post Office, and that they may attempt to insist terms that neither you or the Post or the board can accept. In this scenario, they may either walk away from the scheme or Post Office may have to end their engagement. Was it the case that despite their appointment in mid-2012, no terms of reference or terms of engagement had been settled by February 2013 for Second Sight?
I don't know about terms of engagement. I do know that that terms of reference were drawn up. Engagement, I don't know. That wouldn't have been something that I would have been involved in.
By this time, was it anticipated that Second Sight would refuse to work under the terms of engagement that the Post Office required?
It seems to say so here. I don't recall being aware of that, presumably until this was presented to me, and I'm not entirely sure what that refers to.
Do you know which of these options was chosen? Do you want to look back at options
Yes,
A and
please.
B,
Yeah.
please? On page 1, please. A was clarification of Second Sight's engagement.
Yes. I think A and B, actually. So my recollection at this stage is that there were concerns from the team that very few cases had been reviewed. The time was being extended and therefore the cost extended. And I think that was the main concern, is that the work, for whatever reason, wasn't being completed. And I was given a number of options. I'm sorry, I don't remember the discussion, but my sense is that it was, we want a Second Sight to see this work through. It would have been difficult to stand somebody else up, I think. And anyway, they had the commitment of Lord Arbuthnot and the MPs. But I do think we brought in or changed the way they worked in some way to help them. But I may be confusing that with the mediation scheme, because this issue of time and cost overrun was a fairly frequent topic of conversation.
Can we move forwards to later in 2013, still before their interim report was produced, by looking at poll 309-8437. And looking at page 2, please. And if we just look at the foot of page 1, we'll see an email from Mr. Bates to you of the 21st of May 2013. And he says, "Hello, Paula. It's been a while since we met at James Arbuthnot's office, but at that time you did say that if I had any concerns, I should contact you directly, hence the reason for this email. Would it be possible for Kay Linnell and I to meet you? You recall that Kay is an independent forensic accountant who, on behalf of JFSA, has been monitoring the work Second Sight has been undertaking. The main purpose of the meeting is to ensure that you have been receiving the full details of what has been occurring with the Second Sight investigation. Bearing in mind what has been discovered so far, I, for one, am surprised that we haven't yet met to discuss the implications. Whilst I appreciate the majority of the issues began under previous regimes, and you've expressed a genuine willingness to address the concerns that JFSA has been raising, these issues are still continuing. I've little doubt it's now feasible to show that many of the prosecutions that the Post Office has pressed home should never have taken place. I believe this is a view shared by Kay." At this point in time, did you understand why Mr. Bates was saying that it was feasible that many prosecutions that the Post Office had undertaken should never have taken place?
I don't believe I did, because we were still waiting. The work was still very much a work in progress.
Had any of the in-progress work been fed back to you, i.e. provisional views, what it was showing, early themes, emerging issues?
Not that I can recall with any clarity, because I remember being surprised about, I think slightly, what is the date of this, please?
21st of May.
Of May. Maybe not too long after this, but as we were approaching the production of the interim report, I remember being surprised about some of the conclusions that were being reached, because the criticisms from Post Office were that their work hadn't been taken into account. So I think at this stage, possibly not, other than feedback that the work was going too slowly and Post Office's input either hadn't taken place or Second Sight, there were concerns being raised perhaps that Second Sight were not taking account of it.
Would you have been very concerned reading an email like this, that the person representing a key stakeholder, JFSA, was saying that the prosecutions, and many of them, that the Post Office had brought ought never to have taken place?
I was concerned to get the email from Alan, certainly. The point he's making about the prosecutions was the point that the JFSA had made for, I now know, for a number of years, but that wasn't new news to me at this stage.
Is that how you would have thought of it, that this is just Mr. Bates saying something that he's always said?
No, not at all. I think that I went back to my team and said, because I had said to Mr. Bates that, you know, if he needed to, he should get in touch. So I don't know if there's documentation on this, but I'm pretty sure that I went back to the team and said, what should we do about this? You know, I've offered to meet Mr. Bates. What is your view?
Had you been given any inkling that anything had emerged that might undermine the safety of convictions?
No.
If we go to page 1, please, we'll see your reply. And if we scroll up, you say, I am, second paragraph, happy to meet, but can't make the suggested date. And then the third paragraph, my understanding is we're too early in the investigation to suggest that things have been discovered which call into question the integrity of the system or the validity of the prosecutions, and to suggest that at this stage would be wrong. In order to say that, you must have been told, would this be right, the stage at which the investigation had reached, and whether it was possible to say that the integrity of the system or the validity of prosecutions had, even at that stage, been called into question?
Yes.
And who were you getting that feedback from?
At this stage, I would have talked to whoever was leading the work on this. So Susan Crichton, Alwyn Lyons, I can't remember who else, Simon Baker, presumably David Oliver, whose name we've seen.
And so were you then getting feedback on the state of the investigation by Second Sight in order to be able to say, essentially, Mr. Bates, you're jumping the gun?
I'm almost certain that when I got Alan's note, that I went to the team and said, I've had this note, what's the current status? And as I say here, I would like to meet with Mr. Bates. So I suspect that's where I got that information from.
You say in the last paragraph, I've been advised that Second Sight have now agreed that the focus over the next few weeks will be on 3 specific cases. And the meeting might be a more productive one when that work has been completed. Do you know how it came about that what started as a debate between the choice of Deloitte conducting a full forensic audit of Horizon, Second Sight conducting a review of past cases that would be a representative sample, but include some testing of the integrity of the Horizon system, ended up with focusing on 3 cases?
My recollection is that the team, what I can recall is frustration from the team that the work Second Sight was doing had moved away from focusing on individual cases to development of themes. And what they were trying to do at this stage, and Second Sight as well, to be fair, was to try and corral this back into a piece of work which could have a report which could be fed back to the MPs before we got to recess in just a small number of weeks after this. That's my recollection, and that was to misuse a word in this context, but that was the theme that ran through, which was Second Sight were focusing on themes rather than on individual cases. And at some stage, we will come on to how that then developed into spot reviews, which I think came after this.
And so was it the Post Office, in your view, or Second Sight that narrowed focus down to a very small number of cases?
My view is it was both, because both Second Sight and the Post Office had a commitment to Lord Arbuthnot and the MPs to get some work out for people to look at, and we were now not quite a year, but sort of 10 months into this. That's my recollection.
Were you aware of a view amongst the lawyers, and in particular Susan Crichton, that if we review a large number of cases, that might open the floodgates to damages claims by sub-postmasters?
No.
And that a less risky approach would be to just pick the cases in which the MPs happen to be interested in?
No, I don't remember that at all.
Can we go to the, this is slightly out of order, but it's in order to answer the chairman's question from earlier, the Richard Morgan Casey advice. It's poll 406484. And the date says the 12th of June, 2012. I think this is the advice. We'll see in a moment that it's recorded as a note of an in-person conference of which you weren't aware.
That's right, yes.
And to the best of your knowledge, the board was not aware.
No, I don't believe so. The only person who could possibly be aware might have been Alice Perkins in that conversation Susan had had. But actually, looking at the date of this, I think this comes afterwards, doesn't it?
Yes, if we look at the second bullet point, the proposal to instruct an independent expert to prepare a report on the system is the highest risk response to the issue. Was that view communicated to you?
No.
In fact, a decision had been made, it seems already, at the meeting of the 7th of June 2012, not to instruct an expert to prepare a report, a forensic audit of the Horizon system, hadn't it?
The decision had been made to go, in my head, to go with Second Sight for the right reasons.
The note records what will it achieve, and I'm not going to attribute any of these words to anyone, because when he gave evidence, Mr. Morgan took the point that it's not clear that it's him speaking
Right.
Here, and it doesn't necessarily represent his advice. It could be anyone speaking. What will it achieve? It will not be able to address any of the civil or criminal cases dealt with under old Horizon. Was that advice communicated back to you, that an independent report couldn't look at civil or criminal cases dealt with under old Horizon?
No.
Will it seek to review particular cases? If so, which ones? And then what might be said to be the important paragraph is the third one. Whatever the findings of the expert report, it will not resolve the problem. The Post Office will be damned if they do and damned if they don't. If the findings are that there are no issues with Horizon, people will see that as a whitewash. And then this, whereas if the findings are negative, that will open the floodgates to damages claims by sub-postmasters who were imprisoned for false accounting. And Access Legal, that's part of Shoesmiths, will start to pursue the civil cases they're currently sitting on. Was that view communicated back to you as relevant to decision-making if we commission an independent report which comes back with negative conclusions, people who have been imprisoned might bring claims against us?
No, absolutely not.
And that would be a reason not to commission an independent report, because it might find out things that entitle people to question their convictions or bring damages claims against us.
No, I didn't know about this.
Did that ever form part of your decision-making? We best not ask for the Deloitte report, because if it discovers too much, we may face damages claims.
No.
To your knowledge, did that ever form part of any discussion or decision-making at board level?
No. And as I say, in the meeting where we took the decision to go with Second Sight, I don't remember looking at two separate sets of documents and comparing and contrasting.
And the foot of the screen that's being displayed, a less risky approach is to agree to take the relevant MPs privately through particular cases in which they are interested. Was that ever communicated back to you?
No.
Thank you. Can we return to where we were in the chronology, which is the following year, June 2023, by looking at poll 309 8789. And if we scroll down and look at the text, the message from Olwyn Lyons, it's dated the 28th of June 2013. We're getting quite close here to the date of the production of the Second Sight interim report, aren't we?
Yes.
Which we know was published on the 8th of July 2013. Yeah. It's quite difficult because the way the text has been printed on this email. But if you look at the fourth bullet point, Miss Lyons says to you that she is going to spend time with Janet. Is that Janet Walker?
Yes.
And remind us who Janet Walker was.
Janet Walker was the executive assistant for Lord Arbuthnot.
She says she can give me as long as it takes. My approach will be to try to get to understand the status of the review and the risk to Lord Arbuthnot and us of an incomplete interim report. I'll share the fact that Second Sight are not using all the evidence they've been given, and our concern is that their approach to try and keep everyone happy is not how we would expect a forensic accountant to behave. I do think this is the right place to share the bugs we found and how we have dealt with them, which is why the report from Rod/Leslie, checked by Legal and Mark, is important. My objective is to get Janet to a place where she also wants the meeting to be cancelled. And then if we scroll up, please, we'll see your reply. Sending on to Alice Perkins. Second paragraph, you'll see below Alice's, Olwyn's proposed next steps covers all the ground. Olwyn and I, third paragraph, are staying close, and I'm expecting an update later this afternoon. No need to bother you today. On what basis did you understand the Post Office had determined that Second Sight were not using all of the evidence that the Post Office had given them?
From conversations with the team involved in the work.
Second Sight were getting it wrong. They were
no, I don't
not
think,
looking at the evidence.
No, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut across you. No, I don't think that is what I was told. What I was told is that they hadn't, because this had run on too long, they hadn't yet had time to take account of the Post Office's view in the investigations they were doing. That's my recollection of what I was told, not because they were getting it wrong.
But was there any...
sorry, I beg your pardon. They may have been getting it wrong because they hadn't yet taken account of the input from the Post Office.
Was there a suggestion in what you were told that Second Sight were biased in their approach?
No, certainly not at this stage. My very clear recollection is this was simply, to describe it more colloquially, the team felt it was unfair because Post Office hadn't had the opportunity to contribute yet. Whether that was true or not, I didn't check that with Second Sight, but what I was told is that the work was so far behind that Second Sight had yet to take account of the Post Office's input.
Was the sense of unfairness conveyed to you?
Frustration, I think.
By who?
Olwyn certainly was one of the main people I spoke to, Susan, and I think David Oliver, but I'm only remembered by having seen his name today.
What evidence were you told that the Post Office had provided to Second Sight that they were not using or taking account of?
I can't remember today, I'm sorry. They were looking at a number of they were looking at a number of cases, is my understanding, and these cases raised different issues. So it would have been whatever data the Post Office needed to present about the issue that was being investigated.
Were you told that Second Sight were trying to, in the words of the email, keep everyone happy?
I was told that, and I knew, I think, because we had agreed to fund Kaylin L to support the JFSA, I was told that they, I think, if I remember the timing correctly, that they had been asked by Lord Arbuthnot to keep the JFSA happy. And I don't think we had any problem with that until the team began to raise these questions that perhaps because of that Second Sight we're not looking at the Post Office work. But I'm probably now speculating too much, to be fair.
Did you tell Second Sight that they were being unfair on the Post Office by not taking account of the evidence that the Post Office was giving to them?
I didn't have regular conversations with Second Sight. I was running the organisation. I wasn't closely involved in the detail of this work. I'm not sure if I spoke to him at this time, but I would have had no problem sharing that piece of information.
Did you tell Second Sight about the Post Office's concerns about its approach, or alleged approach, of keeping the JFSA happy?
I don't believe I spoke to Second Sight.
Did anyone, to your knowledge, say, you're not treating us fairly, you're trying to keep the sub-postmasters happy, and you're not looking at our evidence?
I would hope that the Post Office team... Sorry, first of all, I don't think the Post Office team would have said you're trying to keep the sub-postmasters happy. I may be wrong on that, because that feels too strong a view in one direction. This whole point was to look at the sub-postmasters' cases. But I think the team would undoubtedly have said to Second Sight, there is more information here to be taken account of.
Can we look a little more deeply at the move to select a small number of cases by looking at poll 0014-4687? This is the previous month. If we look at page 2, please. And scroll down. An email between Simon Baker and Second Sight, with Olwyn Lyons copied in. Not you at this stage, but it's about a meeting. I think this is the meeting that we've just seen Post Office was going to try and get cancelled.
Right.
Ron, just to ensure that we're on the same page, Paula would like to say we've agreed the following with Second Sight. Can you confirm you agree? The investigation reports on 2 to 3 MPs cases by summer assess or more. By using the 2 to 3 cases, you'll answer the question, have systemic defects in the Horizon system resulted in the wrongful conviction or suspension of sub-postmasters? By this stage, had the proposal that we saw at the first thing this morning to examine a representative sample of cases been abandoned?
Not on my understanding.
How did it come about that by late May, the Post Office was proposing that by looking at 2 to 3 cases, Second Sight could answer the very big question: have systemic defects in the Horizon resulted in the wrongful conviction or suspension of sub-postmasters?
I'm not sure, but when the report was produced, as the inquiry knows, one of the conclusions was that so far no systemic defects had been found. So whether as a result of the broader work, so Second Sight had been working...
Sorry, can you repeat that answer, please?
Yes. When the Second Sight Interim report was published, one of its initial conclusions was that so far no systemic issues had been found with the Horizon system.
And just stopping there,
Yeah.
that's 2 months after this.
Yes, but I'm getting to
I'm-
answer your question,
Yes.
if I may, because to have reached that conclusion, which in a sense is what point 4 here refers to, referring back to point 2, you couldn't reach that conclusion on 2 to 3 cases. So how could you do it on 2 to 3 cases? Because of the other work they had done. They were working through different themes, as I understood it, so potentially through that work. Second Sight had been working on this for 10 months now. They hadn't just done they hadn't even done 2 to 3 cases in that period of time.
Why was the proposal to limit the report to determining whether systemic defects in Horizon had resulted in wrongful convictions on the basis of 2 or 3 cases?
I don't know. I wasn't involved in the conversation. I believe from other documentation I've seen that the recommendation was to choose 2 of the 3, I don't think this is the word, but hardest cases. So not cases that would have presented the Post Office in the best light, but cases which could have been used to challenge the Horizon system and then do that work through. There is some documentation on this somewhere else.
How could 2 or 3 cases possibly answer the question, have systemic defects in Horizon generally resulted in the wrongful conviction?
They couldn't. They could not possibly do that. And I wasn't involved in this conversation, but by this stage, there was an urgency to have a report produced that showed that some work was at least in progress. And
You say you weren't involved in this conversation. This email says you want to say this. Paula would like to say the following.
yes.
Did you want to say that by looking at 2 or 3 cases, we can answer the entire question of whether systemic defects had resulted in the wrongful conviction of sub-postmasters?
I was absolutely not, to be completely clear, trying to drive a conclusion from Second Sight that they would not have given.
It's an answer to a different question.
No, I realise that, but I don't recall the background. So I didn't write this email. I wasn't copied in this email. I don't recall a conversation where I consciously said it would be possible, because it wouldn't be possible, to come to a conclusion on systemic defects as a result of 2 to 3 cases.
Isn't that exactly what happened, Ms. Vennells? That the Second Sight report addressed a very small number of cases. It contained the sentence about no systemic defects, and then forever after, the Post Office paraded that conclusion.
It did come to that conclusion in its interim report. There is no way the Post Office, first of all, there is no way that I would have wanted to persuade Second Sight on something that they were not prepared to say, and I don't believe Second Sight would ever have agreed to that. If they came to that conclusion in their interim report, that was their conclusion.
Isn't that what the Post Office wanted to drive them to? And isn't this the evidence of such driving?
The Post Office most certainly wanted the reassurance that the Horizon system could be relied upon. That has been the objective all the way through this. At no stage did I get the sense that anybody in the Post Office was going to be able to influence Second Sight over what conclusions they came to. I would be very surprised if that was the case here.
Did you receive, or the board receive, any advice as to the appropriate scope of an investigation by Second Sight, as to the nature and extent of any investigation that would be required in order to determine whether there were systemic defects in Horizon?
The only information I and the board had was contained in the terms of reference of the work that Second Sight were doing, which is what we looked at earlier.
I.e., we, the Post Office, need to engage somebody to produce a report whose conclusions are respectable and truly provide us with the answer as to whether or not there are systemic defects in Horizon.
Yes.
You think that's the report they produced?
Second Sight didn't produce the report that Project Spire under Deloitte could have produced. Second Sight responded to the terms of reference which were agreed with them. This work was approached from the point of view of trying to resolve postmaster cases. That was the genesis of it. That was the initial conversation with Lord Arbuthnot and Alice Perkins.
Can we move forwards, please?
Before we do, Mr.
Yes.
Baker, can I just be clear about what you are saying about this email, Ms. Vennells? As I read it, it is a request by Mr. Baker to Mr. Warmington that 4 matters are agreed, and it reads as if he is making that request on your behalf. All right? That's how
Yes,
it reads.
it does read that way.
So what is your evidence to me about whether Mr. Baker was accurately representing what you had told him in this email?
Firstly, Sue, and I don't recall the conversation with Simon Baker
Right?
at all. I rarely met with Simon, and if I did, it was usually with Susan or Alwyn. But it sounds as though at some stage a conversation was had, and I may have accepted that you could. This email could have been produced one of 2 ways, couldn't it? Or multiple ways. I could have said, this is what I want, or he could have said to me, this is where we're at. We think that actually we will get 2 to 3 MP cases done, and I may well have said, will that help us to answer the question about are there systemic defects in the Horizon system? I wouldn't have known personally from any of the, because I wasn't involved in the work or conversations at Second Sight, point 4 about whether they could have said no or not at this stage. So I can only assume that has come from a conversation with Simon Baker and or somebody else.
All right.
Thank you. Can we move forward a couple of days to poll 309-8317? This is a briefing for you for the meeting that was proposed to be held between you and James Arbuthnot on the 23rd of May. Can you see that?
Yes, yes.
And it says, under key messages, we're concerned that the investigation's overrunning, the findings will not be definitive, and there'll be no satisfactory outcome to the horizon question for MPs or the Post Office. We would like to discuss ways to more clearly define the scope so we get a definitive outcome within reasonable timescales. And then under the heading background, 2.1, when the Post Office commissioned Second Sight, the expectation was that the investigation would review a small number of MP cases, 6 to 12 cases. Firstly, does that represent your recollection of the Post Office's expectation when Second Sight were being instructed?
I don't remember today, but we were talking to Lord Arbuthnot and I think 2 or 3 other MPs, so that's entirely possible.
Do you know why it was the Post Office's expectation that a smallish number of cases, 6 to 12, would be the limit of Second Sight's review?
Presumably because that was the number that was being discussed at the time.
Discussed by who?
With James Arbuthnot and the team working on it. I don't recollect 6 to 12 cases as a particular number, because what I remember is that the number increased as more MPs raised cases.
You remember the Second Sight proposal that we looked at? Its suggested scope of work
Yes.
was to review a representative sample of cases in order to answer the question of whether there had been wrongful convictions.
Yes.
Was that the Post Office's understanding when it was commissioning Second Sight that that's the work that it would be undertaking?
If that is what was in the final terms of reference, yes.
The the speaking note or briefing carries on. MPs have now submitted 29 cases and JFSA have submitted about 20 cases. It's unlikely that the investigation, no matter how long it runs, will conclude anything definitive. As the remit has become blurred, different stakeholders have different expectations and the evidence is open to interpretation. Was that a view that you held at the time?
I didn't have a view on the work because I wasn't closely associated with it, so I would take the view that I was given by the experts who were doing the work at the time.
So you would subscribe to or be willing to repeat that view expressed in 2.3?
Not necessarily. I mean, if I was given information, I would usually ask questions about it. I don't know what I did with this brief at the time.
The suggestion that any investigation would conclude anything definitive, was that your understanding?
No, I don't think that was my understanding at any time throughout this, and the inquiry will see there is further documentation where I'm exhorting the Post Office and Second Sight to move through the cases because I wanted the cases looked at. There was at this time actually as a potential helpful issue. A number of cases had come through, I think, from MPs, and there was some debate about whether there was sufficient information and quality of information to be able to do any work on them at all. And that was Second Sight's view. They went back to some of those cases, and in some cases they couldn't produce information. So whether that was part of this point, I don't know.
Did the Post Office subsequently present Second Sight's interim report as a definitive view that there were no systemic errors or failures in Horizon?
The Post Office presented it sometimes definitively and sometimes less so, yes.
Do you know how that came about, given what is recognised by this note at this stage?
No, I think what happened is that when the interim report was published and it said it was an interim report and so far it had found no systemic issues with Horizon, that was reported sometimes in communications saying so far they had found none. Mm-hmm. And there is documentation where I'm asked about, or maybe I offered the view that actually the qualification was so far. And there are other communications which may simply be inconsistency of communication, I don't know, which simply says they had found nothing systemic.
Under the heading, just above the heading, proposal 2.6, the investigation's been running for a year, and to date, no evidence of systemic failures has been found. Proposal, James Arbuthnot to request Second Sight to complete the investigations on 2 to 3 MPs' cases, selecting the ones they feel best indicate systemic problems.
That was the point I was trying to make earlier, thank you.
How would an individual case indicate systemic problems?
I don't know that I can answer that question. It couldn't, could it?
Bit tricky, isn't it?
It's very tricky, yes.
This was a briefing to you of what you should say and seek to achieve in a meeting with James Arbuthnot. Yes?
Yes.
Had you signed up to this idea by this time, at least then, that James Arbuthnot should be asked to persuade Second Sight to wind their investigation up on 2 to 3 cases, and those 2 to 3 cases would answer the question, have systemic defects resulted in the wrongful conviction of sub-postmasters?
Could you ask the question again?
Yes.
I'm sorry.
Had by this stage,
yes,
in readiness for the meeting with James Arbuthnot on the 23rd of May 2013, you signed up to the idea that he would be asked to persuade Second Sight or request Second Sight to wind their investigation up on the basis of 2 to 3 MP cases answering the question, have systemic defects in Horizon resulted in the wrongful conviction of sub-postmasters?
I don't believe so, because we had committed to a larger number of cases. There were significantly more cases now in, I was going to say the scheme, but we're not yet into the scheme, but now in the project. This was an interim report, and I don't think there is any evidence that I thought that was the case. My understanding was that we had made a commitment to the MPs, and all the way through this, I wanted all of the cases looked at.
We've seen now an email that attributes to you a suggestion that you wanted to agree this with James Arbuthnot, and a speaking note or a briefing note saying the same thing.
It doesn't say that I'm trying to wind the scheme up, which I think was your question.
Okay, they should focus on answering the question, have systemic defects in Horizon resulted in the wrongful conviction of sub-postmasters by reference to 2 to 3 cases?
Yeah, so...
Was that your view as to what should happen?
No, at no stage did I make the link that you have just led me to make between these 2 to 3 cases and being able to reach a view on the system and being able to complete the whole piece of work. What I was very aware of is that this was an interim review coming up, and that there were more cases to go through the scheme.
The link is made right here in this document, isn't it? In paragraphs 3.1 and 3.2.
It is, and as I mentioned earlier, before the document came up, my understanding was that from the work Second Sight had done, presumably around the thematic work where they had been looking at a number of cases, and they're now being asked to take 2 or 3 cases which may or may not show whether sub-postmasters had been wrongfully convicted.
Can we move forward?
I was not trying to close anything down. It's really important that I say that.
Can we move forwards, please, to closer to the production of the interim report? Poll 309-9003. An email from Martin Edwards. Can you explain who Mr. Edwards was at this time, July 13?
Martin Edwards was my chief of staff.
He emails you on the 4th of July with a draft for the board. He says, hopefully it's not too long, but it's difficult not to open some of these issues without providing a reasonably full explanation. And so what follows is this, right, a draft email that you were to send to your board.
Right.
Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And then beneath the dotted line, we see the draft email. I wanted to send you a brief email to update you on where we are with the Second Sight investigation. We've been engaging closely with Second Sight throughout the week to understand the position they intend to take in the interim report, and emphasising our concern that their findings must be even-handed and grounded in the facts. In line with our discussion on Monday's board call, we understand they've not found any evidence yet of systemic issues with the Horizon system, and it should be noted that this is based on a detailed review of their 4 best cases in terms of compelling evidence. So by this time, I think you had drawn a link between a review of a small number of cases, it's got up to 4, and whether there were systemic issues with Horizon.
Yes, but I hadn't drawn that link. That, I think the way I read this is that is what the team had understood from Second Sight.
What Second Sight were prepared to say that there were no systemic issues with Horizon generally on the basis of looking at four cases.
That appears to be the case, but as I've said, they also were doing wider work by this stage.
What was your understanding at this point at what systemic issues meant?
I'm not sure, as I say in my statement, that I was able to make an informed decision on that. Second Sight themselves, I think, refer to it as something that might have a broad impact across the post offices or across the system. I can't remember, but you will have the reference.
Was there a shared...
And so my assumption, if they felt they could reach this conclusion from a small number of cases, was that perhaps, but this is my reflection today, I don't think I had the reflection at the time, was that perhaps they had seen something in those cases that could have occurred elsewhere. But I'm speculating to try and help answer the question that I didn't ask at the time.
Was there a shared understanding between you and the Post Office Board as to what systemic issues meant?
I don't think the conversation ever happened.
Was there a shared understanding between you and the Post Office team that were leading on the work with Second Sight as to what systemic issues meant?
No.
Was there any discussion over what systemic issues meant?
I don't recall one, no.
Thank you. So it's 11 o'clock. May we take the morning break until 15:15?
Yeah.
Thank you.